Mark Johnson had lived in the Lakeside Haven neighborhood for over 5 years. It was the kind of community that prided itself on well-manicured lawns, pristine sidewalks, and a strict adherence to the HOA guidelines. Mark didn't mind most of it. After retiring from the military, he was just looking for some peace and quiet, a place where he could relax, enjoy his hobbies, and perhaps find some solace in the routine of small-town suburban life. One of his favorite pastimes was fishing. Not the high-intensity, deep-sea kind, but quiet, tranquil moments sitting on a folding chair beside the neighborhood lake with his fishing rod in hand, the gentle lapping of water soothing his nerves. Every Sunday, Mark had a ritual. He'd pack a thermos of coffee, grab his tackle box, and walk down the gravel path behind his house to the lake. It was a peaceful body of water tucked behind a patch of trees, nestled like a secret between the homes on Maple Drive and the community park. Mark wasn't the only one who used it. Kids often played near the edge, couples walked around it, and the occasional teenager would skip stones or play music on a Bluetooth speaker. But Mark was probably the only one who actually fished there, regularly. He'd catch smallmouth bass or catfish, most of which he released. It wasn't about the fish. It was about the peace. But that tranquility was shattered one crisp Sunday morning. Mark had just gotten a nice tug on his line when he heard the familiar whine of the HOA golf cart. He looked up to see Brenda, the head of the HOA board, rolling up the path like a mall cop on a mission. She was wearing her usual windbreaker, sunglasses, and that ever-present expression of petty authority. In her hands, she clutched a clipboard like it was a judge's gavel. She stopped just a few feet from where Mark sat and crossed her arms. "Mr. Johnson," she said with that unmistakable tone of condescension, "you're aware that fishing is not allowed in this lake, correct?" Mark blinked at her, genuinely confused. "Excuse me?" "There's a sign posted right at the entrance to the lake path. It clearly says, 'No fishing.' You're in violation of HOA rules." Mark turned his head and looked toward the barely visible metal sign at the path's entrance. It was rusted, bent, and so faded by the sun and time that the text was nearly unreadable. "That thing? I thought it was from the previous development. I've been fishing here for years. No one's ever said a word." "Well, it's against the rules. And now that it's been brought to our attention, we're obligated to enforce it." "You're joking, right?" Mark stood up slowly, not angrily, just baffled. "You're telling me that this lake, this tiny little lake that no one even maintains properly, suddenly can't be fished in because of some half-rotted sign?" "Rules are rules," Brenda said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You'll be receiving a formal notice in the mail." Mark shook his head. "There's got to be better things for the HOA to do than this." Brenda didn't respond. She just jotted something down on her clipboard, turned the cart around, and drove off like a tyrant who had just claimed another petty victory. Mark didn't think much of it at first. He figured it would blow over. Maybe he'd get a warning or a letter. But a week later, an envelope from the HOA showed up in his mailbox. Inside was a formal citation, a $150 fine for unauthorized recreational activity on community property. Mark's jaw clenched as he read the letter twice. It was official. They were serious. They had actually fined him for fishing. It felt surreal, like being ticketed for sitting too long on a park bench. His first instinct was to call the HOA office, but they had limited phone hours. So he went in person to their next scheduled board meeting. The board met once a month in the community center, and it was usually a boring affair of budget reports and landscaping proposals. But that night, Mark walked in with fire in his eyes. The board members sat in a semicircle behind a folding table, Brenda in the middle like the queen of a paper kingdom. "I'm here about the fishing fine," Mark said flatly, holding the citation in his hand. Brenda didn't even look surprised. "Mr. Johnson, the board reviewed the violation and stands by the decision. The lake is part of the common area and governed by HOA guidelines. Fishing is prohibited under Rule 7.3b. Mark took a deep breath. "I've fished there for years. No one's ever said anything. That sign is older than this board. If you're going to enforce it now, it should be properly posted, updated, and clearly communicated." Another board member, a balding man named George, spoke up. We understand your frustration, but the rules haven't changed. We're simply enforcing what's already in place. So I'm being fined for doing something that's never been enforced, never communicated, and never caused harm to anyone? That's correct, Brenda said calmly. And as per the HOA agreement, failure to pay the fine within 30 days will result in additional penalties. It wasn't just the fine that got to Mark, it was the principle of it. He wasn't some rule breaker. He paid his dues. He kept his lawn trimmed. He attended meetings when he could. And yet here he was, being punished for something as innocent as fishing. He left the meeting more angry than he expected. It wasn't the kind of rage that burned hot and fast. It was the slow, simmering kind that built up under the surface, deep and quiet. He sat on his porch that night with a drink in his hand, staring at the lake in the distance, the moonlight reflecting off the surface like a silent mirror. That lake had been his sanctuary, and now it was the symbol of everything wrong with the HOA. He thought about how they use their tiny bit of power to control people's lives, how a simple moment of peace could be stripped away by a clipboard and a smile. Then an idea took root in his mind, a wild idea. One that seemed ridiculous at first, but the longer he sat there, the more it began to make sense. What if he didn't just fight the fine? What if he fought the system? He pulled out his laptop and started researching. Property lines, county, records, development history. He wanted to know everything about that lake. Who really owned it? Who was responsible for it? What was the legal status of that piece of land? What he found stunned him. The lake, it turned out, wasn't formally deeded to the HOA. Years ago, the original developer of the community had gone bankrupt and never transferred ownership of certain parcels, including the lake. It was technically still listed as private, land owned by the developer's shell company, now inactive but still legally on file. Mark leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. If that land wasn't owned by the HOA, it could be purchased. It could be his. And suddenly the fine didn't matter anymore. The fishing didn't matter. The rules didn't matter. Because if this worked, if he could buy the lake, then everything would change. And he'd make sure the HOA knew exactly what it felt like to be on the receiving end of arbitrary power. Mark couldn't sleep that night. The information he had uncovered changed everything. The lake, the center of his dispute with the HOA, was not owned by the HOA at all. It was a rogue asset, a forgotten piece of property left in legal limbo by a defunct development company that had gone belly up over a decade ago. Most people in the neighborhood assumed it was common property managed by the HOA, but assumptions didn't hold up in court, and Mark knew it. If the deed still existed, if the records could be transferred, then legally, it was just a piece of private land waiting for a new owner. By the next morning, Mark was already on the phone with the county assessor's office. He played it cool, pretending to be a curious resident, wondering about the boundaries and ownership of the lake area. The clerk on the other end pulled up the parcel map, clicked around, and then paused. Huh, interesting. That particular parcel, it's not registered to the HOA. Says here it still belongs to Westbridge Developments LLC, but that company's been inactive since, 2011. Is it available? Mark asked. Well, the clerk said cautiously, if the company is dissolved, the assets might have reverted to the holding trustee or are simply dormant. But if you can contact the last legal agent, or if it's been handed to a property management service, you could negotiate a sale. Mark wrote down every name and reference number the clerk gave him. He thanked her, hung up, and immediately started his deep dive. He found the defunct company's filings, traced the registered agent to an older man named Gary Whitlock, and after calling 5 disconnected numbers and digging through obscure online databases, he finally got a lead. Gary had passed away in 2018, but his son, Leonard, had inherited most of the company's remaining assets, including any unsold land. Leonard ran a small real estate business out of another state. Mark called the number and left a voicemail. A day passed, then another. Finally, on the 3rd day, Leonard called back. You're interested in what? Leonard asked, confused. The lake in the Lakeside Haven community, parcel 14B. It's still in your name, Or technically, under the old company. I want to buy it. Leonard laughed. You want to buy that? Swampy retention pond? It's not a swamp, it's a lake, with fish and walking trails. And more importantly, I live in that neighborhood and have a very good reason to want to own it. Leonard paused. You know, you're the first person in 15 years who's asked about that land. We've paid taxes on it every year just to avoid a lien, but it's been a dead weight. You're serious about buying it? Dead serious. They negotiated over the phone for nearly an hour. Mark offered a fair price, more than Leonard expected, but well within Mark's financial comfort zone. They settled on an amount, and Mark hired a real estate attorney the same day to expedite the paperwork. The transaction went smoothly. The land had no encumbrances, no liens, and no pending disputes. A few forms later, and a wire transfer to Leonard's escrow account, the lake was officially Mark's. He held the final deed in his hands a week later. It felt surreal. This wasn't a symbolic victory. It was a legally binding one. He was the owner of the entire lake and the surrounding 30 feet of shore perimeter. Every drop of water, every reed, every rock, every fish, it was all his. The next thing Mark did was visit the county recorder's office to file the deed. They scanned his documents, stamped them, and updated the online property records. It was official. Within days, the database reflected his ownership. The lake that had once gotten him fined was now legally and entirely his. Mark stood at the edge of the water the next morning with a steaming cup of coffee in his hand and an enormous grin on his face. He could already imagine the look on Brenda's face. But he wasn't going to stop with paperwork. He wanted to make it absolutely clear who held the power now. He hired a local sign-making company to produce new metal signs. Private property, no trespassing, by order of the owner. He paid extra to have them delivered and installed within 48 hours. 8 signs went up along the shoreline, 2 at each access point and several in plain view of the trail Brenda loved to walk her little yappy dog along. Next came the fence. He didn't fence off the entire lake, just the spots where people had commonly wandered in from the trails. A clean, tasteful black iron fence that matched the community aesthetic, but with locked gates and private access-only plaques. On the 3rd day, he installed 2 trail cameras on motion sensors, feeding real-time video to his phone. Not because he was afraid of vandalism, but because he wanted receipts for the moment the HOA realized what he had done. Mark didn't need to wait long. That Saturday, a group of children tried to access the lake as they always had. One of the parents was with them, a man named Dennis who often let his kids run near the water while he chatted with joggers. But this time, they found a locked gate and a sign that made it clear they were no longer welcome. Dennis called Brenda. Brenda called the HOA emergency number. An hour later, Mark's phone buzzed. It was a number from the board. He ignored it. 10 minutes later, a knock came at his door. It was Brenda, again with her clipboard. "Mark," she said, voice tight and trembling with barely disguised outrage. "What exactly is going on at the lake?" Mark leaned casually against the doorframe. "Oh, didn't you hear? I bought it." Brenda blinked. "You what?" "I bought the lake. It was never yours to govern. The deed is in my name. I've already registered it with the county, and since it's private property now, I've posted the proper signage, restricted access, and installed surveillance just like any responsible landowner would." "You can't do that," she burst out. "I already did." She shifted her stance, trying to find some leverage. "This is a community resource. People have used that lake for years." "You mean the lake you fined me for fishing in? You said it was against the rules. Now no one gets to use it, unless I say so." Brenda's jaw tightened. "This is going to cause an uproar. The board will have something to say about this. They're welcome to file a complaint with me, or maybe with the county if they want to explain why they thought they owned land they never legally acquired." Brenda had no response. She turned on her heel and walked away. Word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Some people thought Mark had gone too far. Others quietly applauded his boldness. Parents were upset, joggers irritated, but the truth was undeniable. Mark had outplayed the HOA at their own game. That weekend, Mark sat by the lake, fishing rod in hand, a cooler of soda beside him, and a Bluetooth speaker playing soft jazz. He waved at the occasional passerby, smiling at the expressions of confusion, curiosity, or quiet resentment. He didn't care anymore. What had started as a petty fine had turned into a masterstroke of revenge, and it was only just beginning. You said, Mark had never imagined that owning a lake would be so satisfying, not because of the water, the fish, or the scenery, though those were all nice perks, but because of the control. For the first time since moving into Lakeside Haven, he felt truly free. Not just free from fines or ridiculous rules, but from the smug authority the HOA held over the residents. The same authority that had once slapped him with a $150 citation for fishing now had no power over him when it came to the lake, and he made sure everyone knew it. Within days of posting the no trespassing signs, the mood around the neighborhood began to shift. People who once strolled freely down the path to the lake now stopped short, reading the signs with disbelief. Parents who brought their kids to throw bread to the ducks found the area fenced off. Teenagers looking to hang out near the water were turned away by the locked gates. Mark had even added a solar-powered speaker that automatically played a recorded message when motion was detected near the property lines. This is private property. Entry without permission is prohibited. It was all legal. The lake, once assumed to be public or HOA-owned, was now off-limits to everyone but Mark and whoever he chose to allow in. At first, he thought it would be a lonely victory. But to his surprise, several neighbors began approaching him quietly, not in anger but in admiration. "You actually bought the lake?" one whispered during a morning walk. Mark nodded. "HOA didn't own it. I just checked the records." "That's genius," the man said, shaking his head with a smile. "Absolutely genius." Still, not everyone was impressed, especially not the HOA board. They were furious. Brenda, in particular, had taken the entire ordeal personally. Her leadership had been undermined, her decisions challenged, and now, in the eyes of the neighborhood, she'd become the woman who tried to fine a veteran for fishing and ended up losing control of the community lake. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. Residents packed the community hall, curious about the lake controversy. Mark sat near the back, arms folded across his chest, as Brenda opened the meeting with her usual stern expression. "We need to address a recent and unfortunate development," she said. "One of our residents has purchased land that many of us believe to be community property." There were murmurs across the room, some in surprise, some in disbelief. Brenda continued, "While legally the parcel may not have been transferred to the HOA, the spirit of our community is built on shared access and cooperation. Mr. Johnson's actions, while technically legal, go against that spirit." Mark raised his hand. Brenda hesitated, clearly not thrilled to let him speak, but she couldn't ignore the room's eyes all turning toward him. He stood up slowly. "You fined me for fishing. You used rules that were never enforced, signs that were rusted and faded, and claimed authority over land that wasn't even yours. I tried to reason with you, and you refused to budge. So I did the one thing you never expected. I checked the facts. I followed the law. And now, I own the lake." The room fell silent. "I didn't break any rules. I followed the ones that actually matter, the legal ones. And I'm not here to cause chaos, but I am here to remind all of you that if the HOA is going to wield power, it better be accurate, fair, and grounded in reality." A few people clapped quietly. Others nodded. Brenda didn't respond. She looked down at her agenda, flustered, and moved on to the next topic. After the meeting, several neighbors approached Mark, some with sympathy, others with hope. "Would you ever open the lake again?" one woman asked. Mark gave her a small smile. "Maybe someday, but not to everyone, not to the ones who cheered when I got fined." That was the truth. Mark wasn't out for revenge against everyone, just those who blindly enforced rules or enabled them. He began to curate a list of approved visitors, residents who had supported him, or who he knew were decent, fair people. He made it clear to each one that access was conditional. Respect the space, clean up after yourself, and don't bring it up at HOA meetings. To further cement his control, Mark began making subtle improvements. He cleared debris from the shoreline, installed a small dock at one end, and brought in a bench where he liked to sit and fish. The area began to look better than it ever had under HOA oversight. Then came the letters. The HOA sent Mark a formal request to return the lake to the community. They claimed it was in the best interest of the neighborhood, that his private ownership created division and resentment, and that his actions violated the community spirit agreement of Lakeside Haven. Mark didn't even bother responding. Instead, he posted a photo of the deed on the neighborhood Facebook group with a caption that read, "Just a reminder, facts over feelings." The post went viral within the community. Some laughed, others fumed. Brenda deleted her account. The next day, feeling emboldened, Mark decided to escalate a little further. He hosted a private fishing day by invitation only. He invited 10 people, families, retirees, and neighbors he'd grown close to. They brought folding chairs, coolers, snacks, and spent the afternoon laughing, chatting, and catching fish. It was peaceful. It was joyful. And most importantly, it was a statement. Across the fence, a few residents stood watching. Some tried to wave their kids over, hoping to join. But Mark, ever polite, waved back and said simply, "Private. Vent." Word reached the HOA board within an hour. At their next emergency meeting, they tried to pass a new rule. All water features within HOA boundaries must be managed by the HOA. Mark's attorney shut that down immediately. The HOA had no jurisdiction over land it didn't own. Attempting to assert control over it now would result in a lawsuit, and they knew it. With legal options exhausted and public support divided, the HOA finally backed off. They never admitted defeat, but they stopped challenging Mark. Brenda stepped down from the board 3 months later, citing personal reasons. Her replacement, a younger man named Nathan, made a point to visit Mark personally and said, "We may not agree on everything, but I respect what you did. Just hope someday you'll reconsider opening the lake again." Mark considered it. Maybe someday, but not yet. He was still enjoying the irony too much. The same HOA that once tried to control every inch of his life was now forced to look at the one piece of the neighborhood they couldn't touch. His lake. He still fished there every Sunday. Sometimes alone, sometimes with guests. Each time he'd cast his line, take a deep breath, and enjoy the silence, the water, and the hard-won peace. The lake wasn't just his property now. It was his sanctuary, his victory, and his reminder that sometimes the best way to beat the system is to play by its rules better than it can. And every time he looked across the water at those no trespassing signs, he smiled. The HOA had tried to fine him for fishing, and now they weren't allowed within 20 feet of the shoreline.